And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you. Dr. Joseph Luciani is a clinical psychologist who has been in general practice since 1977 in northern New Jersey. He is a popular lecturer, guest speaker, and author who has appeared on numerous television and radio programs around the country. Dr. Luciani earned his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology in San Diego. Dr. Luciani is the author of Healing Your Habits, Introducing Direct Imagination, a Successful Technique for Overcoming Addictive Problems, Self-Coaching, How to Heal Anxiety and Depression, and The Power of Self-Coaching, the 5 essential steps to creating the life you want. Please welcome Dr. Joseph Luciani.
What comes to mind when we think of the word anxiety? How about the word depression? These very words seem to stir up in us a feeling of uneasiness, perhaps disquiet, confusion. You know, when you're hijacked with symptoms like sadness, crying, fatigue, appetite disturbance, sexual dysfunction, fear, worry, difficulty concentrating, and feelings of hopelessness. These feelings can make us feel very desperate. And you know what's worse is no one seems to understand what we're going through. You may hear someone say, just snap out of it. It's all in your mind. Or don't be ridiculous. Well, it's not all in your mind, and you're not being ridiculous, because anxiety and depression are whole body problems with both biochemical and emotional underpinnings. Obviously, anxiety and depression can become very serious, if not life-threatening problems, especially if they're left untreated. They run through your life, affecting not just you, but your family, your friends, your job, your career. So as much as anxiety and depression are whole life problems, they're also whole body problems. And these monstrous effects, although they can disrupt your entire life, one thing you need to know is that anxiety and depression have a weakness, an Achilles heel, a weakness that can be exploited. And that's why we're here today. I hope to be able to tell you a little bit about a self-coaching approach that can help you exploit this weakness. Before going into specifics, I'd like to start out today with a brief little amusing story about a frog named Ribbit and a wall of a problem. Once upon a time, there was a swamp. And this swamp was completely enclosed by a very formidable stone wall. And in this swamp, there were a community of frogs. And for all the history of all the frogs that ever lived in that swamp, no frog had ever gone beyond the stone wall. You can imagine the curiosity. The mayor of the frog community decided one day to have a race, a contest of the bravest and the fittest of all the frogs. We've got to get a frog over that wall. The day of the race occurred. 5 of the strongest and the bravest frogs lined up at that starting line. They were ready. They were pumped up. There was a 6th frog. Not too many people noticed the 6th frog. He was a rather sickly, frail little frog named Ribbit. The gun went off, and the frogs started to careen down the path, Ribbit far behind. Now, one thing you need to know about frogs, and you can trust me on this, frogs are eternal pessimists. As the 5 frogs, along with Ribbit following, careened down that path, The frogs on the sideline began to scream, "Stop! Don't do it! You're going to kill yourself! It's not too late!" One by one, the frogs began to drop out of the race, until one frog was left, little Ribbit. Ribbit kept going, undeterred. He came close to the wall and he took a mighty leap. Almost made it to the top, not quite. Ribbit made it to about a foot below the top, and he held on. He didn't give up. The crowd below went hysterical. "Let go! We can catch you! It's not too late! Drop down!" Ribbit kept going. He kept going, undeterred. He reached the top of the wall, and Ribbit was the first frog in the history of all frogdom to see beyond the wall. Now, Ribbit certainly wasn't the strongest, and he wasn't the bravest. But the reason Ribbit prevailed, the reason he succeeded where no frog had ever succeeded before, was because Ribbit was deaf. Insecurity-driven thoughts are like hysterical frogs. There are hysterical frogs within you that try to discourage you, that try to sabotage you, and try to get you to abandon that in you which is your quest to get over your wall of anxiety or depression. Now, I hope to convince you today that anxiety and depression can only exist if you listen to that in you which is contaminated by fear, by doubt, by negativity. When I was in high school, we had a class clown affectionately called Dookie. And Dookie one day committed an academic misdemeanor and was ejected from the class. He went to the doorway and he stood there holding himself by the coat. And he started going like this. The teacher, frustrated and angry, yelled out, "What are you doing?" Dookie responded, "I'm holding myself back." You see, that's what happens to us. We're holding ourselves back and we don't know it. Self-coaching needs to teach you, a self-coached attitude needs to teach you to let go, to stop listening to that in you which is holding you back. You need to turn a deaf ear to "I can't, I won't, it's too hard." Now, I would bet that if I went around and asked most of you today, what about anxiety? What about depression? What would you call it? What do you think about it? I would imagine that most of you would tell me that it's a mental illness, that these are perhaps diseases. Well, what we call something is very important. I feel that words shape us. They affect us. Mark Twain once said that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is like the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. To me, mental illness is not almost the right word, it's the wrong word. When I think of an illness or a sickness, I think of something you catch, something that infiltrates your body and leaves you its victim. You catch a cold, you catch a flu. If you step on a rusty nail, you contract tetanus. You don't catch or contract anxiety or depression. You generate it. Now, why is this important? Because with a cold, a flu, or tetanus, you're nothing more than a passive victim. A victim of some outside nefarious force. And a victim, by definition, is someone without power, someone who's helpless. So if you think of anxiety and depression as an illness, you can't help but feel victimized. So let's change the language. Rather than illness or disease, I'm going to suggest today a rather heretical notion that we begin to think of anxiety and depression as habits. Habits that you generate. Now let me stop here for a minute, because some of you may be wondering, but wait a second, doesn't anxiety and depression run in families? Doesn't that mean there are genetic underpinnings? There are. And it's true that anxiety and depression are more prevalent in the family history with depression or anxiety. Now, I'm not saying that genetics are irrelevant, far from it. But what I'm saying is that a genetic disposition is not a life sentence. Because if you believe that you are predestined to anxiety or depression, again, you are victimizing yourself. A genetic disposition is not a life sentence. What it is a tendency toward anxiety or depression. A tendency toward. Now, the issue isn't whether you're predisposed to anxiety or depression. The issue is whether you feed it or whether you starve it. That's the issue. Let's imagine on a day like today, this gorgeous spring day, that you decide to go out on your patio and read a paper. So you go outside and you unfold your paper and you're sitting there. And you notice a little pigeon milling around, little cute little pigeon. And you throw it a few crumbs. You go on to your paper. You come back the next day and you see your little pigeon has brought a buddy along. You throw a few more crumbs. This is wonderful. You're enjoying the company. You read your paper. A week later you come back and you can't get out on your patio. There's hundreds of pigeons milling around, feathers, droppings. So you call me up. Dr. Joe, I can't get on my patio. There are too many pigeons. What should I do? I'd have one question for you. Are you still feeding the pigeons? You answer yes. Then I would say stop feeding the pigeons. If you want to reclaim your life, if you want to break the habits of anxiety and depression, then you must learn to stop feeding these habits. Now remember in the introduction I mentioned that depression and anxiety have an Achilles heel, a weakness. This is that Achilles heel. Anxiety and depression are habits that need to be fed in order to persist. One thing about habits are learned, and habits can be broken. This is the weak point. Now, before discussing how exactly we stop feeding anxiety and depression, I think it's important to have a little better understanding about my self-coaching attitude that I think you need to bring to bear to make a difference in your life. Simply put, anxiety and depression create psychological friction. Now, you know, in a car, with its automobile, a car's engine, requires oil to keep the moving parts from rubbing together, causing friction and coming to a halt. With anxiety and depression, there's also friction created by the anxiety and depression. And this friction will bring you to a halt, both emotionally and chemically. You need to stop the friction. You need to stop the erosion to your personality. And that's right, I'm saying you. Not your therapist, not your friend, not your spouse, not a pill, and not a self-help book. As important as these various treatments may be, or as adjuncts as they may be to your process, it's only you that can rescue you. And you need to start to adapt this non-victim approach, because you have everything you need right here. Right here. You need to listen to that in you which is not contaminated by those frogs. You can't, you won't. We need to move away from that and get a clearer perception of the potential that resides in you to begin starving anxiety and depression. Now, sometimes when you're so depressed, I realize it's hard to just get your motor going. It's hard to overcome the inertia. You feel stuck. Learning to take responsibility is just something that you just feel overwhelmed about. And that's why I developed a self-coaching approach. Because you see, coaching lights a fire. What does a good coach do? get you going, get you a little momentum going, get you over the hump. A good coached attitude starts things in motion. You see, psychological theory, understanding, that's terrific, and that assists you. You need both. You need the coaching, you need the understanding. In the late 1980s, I was running the New York City Marathon, and it was my first marathon. I had never run a marathon before. I was ill-prepared. And I started out on pure adrenaline. The Verrazano Bridge, I went out like one of those frogs in the race. And I'm getting over the bridge and starting to feel blisters and aches, but you know what? It was nothing. Getting down Brooklyn, high-fiving all the kids, feeling terrific. Got as far as the midpoint, which was the Pulaski Bridge, just going into Queens. Everything broke down. It was wham! My whole body just shut down, almost like an acute depression. I couldn't stand it. I didn't want to take another step. I wanted to quit. I was whining. I hated it. I just wanted to figure out, how do I get to Central Park from Queens? You know, being from Jersey, we don't know these things. And how do you do it and keep face? You know, I had my family and relatives in Central Park. You know, do I stop at Starbucks for a while and then just show up 4 hours later? It was at that point that I saw draped over one of the buildings in Queens. And I think it was introduced, this is the late 80s, the Nike swoosh with the words, "Just do it." First time I'd ever seen it. It registered almost immediately. Just do it. I mean, it made such simple sense. Yeah, what's the problem? Just do it. Now, what that did for me, it sort of pulled me away from the slide, the vortex of negativity. And I just put one foot down in front of the other one. Yeah, just do it. And then another foot. Plop, plop, plop. And you can see that as you begin to progress, you get a little bit further away from the stagnation, the inertia, the pull downward. I finished that race. My time wasn't respectable, but I'll tell you, to me, when I was on that Pulaski Bridge, it would have been an impossibility to imagine. Those words were able to get me to run 10 more hours. I don't remember what it was. I won't lie. But those 3 words made me finish that race. The power of words and how they react and how we react to those words. So let's begin. We need a little motivation. We need the coaching aspect. If you've got depression, if you've got anxiety in your life, we need to get you into that mode where it's one step in front of the other. Let's just do it. Now, let's take you today. Here you are today. You're sitting at this talk. Something got you here today. If you're suffering anxiety and depression, something got you here today. That's a start. Regardless of how you might feel. And maybe you feel a little like I did during that race where you just want to quit. Or where you're overwhelmed. Or where you've had it. But you know what? Something got you here today. And that something is what we're trying to address. That's the spark. That's the seed. That's what we need to tie you into. Because that is what we will feed, and that is what we need to get you to realize that in order to go forward, we need to start with your attitude. Now, I'll admit, when I ran the marathon, I had a distinct advantage. When I saw just do it, it was simple. All I had to do was put left in front of right and right in front of left. It was simple. With anxiety and depression, of course, it's not that simple. But we can simplify it. We can make it simpler. 50% is the coaching, just the belief, embracing the belief. The other 50% is taking this whole aspect, this whole milieu of what we call anxiety, depression, and condensing it into the 2 words you've heard me mention, feeding and starving. It can be that simple. You're either feeding it or you're starving it. With that simple paradigm, you can begin to know whether you're going in the right direction or the wrong direction. So when it comes to anxiety and depression, you're either feeding or you're starving. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. So with this background, now we're ready to understand a more complete picture of how you feed the habits of anxiety and depression. Three things happen when you become anxious or depressed. The first is that insecurity generates fear. Now, usually when you feel fearful, you feel out of control. So insecurity generates fear. The second thing that happens is that the fear is countered by a desire to control life. So we have insecurity generating fear. You counter the fear by trying to control life, and controlling life wears you down. It depletes you. Those are the three things. Fear created by insecurity. Trying to counter life by trying to control it. And then finally, the depletion that takes place from the effort to control life. So let's look at the first component, insecurity. The dictionary defines insecurity as a lack of self-confidence or assurance. From a self-coaching perspective, insecurity is the anticipation of danger, of chaos, of helplessness. Insecurity has a limited vocabulary. It's kind of easy to pick up. You just need to know three basic concepts. It speaks to you in terms of worry, doubts, or negatives. I should say it should be doubts, fears, and negatives. We'll get to worry in just a second. I assure you we'll get to worry. That ubiquitous term that we all know. So there are three expressions of insecurity: doubts, fears, and negatives. And what you have to do is get your antenna up. You need to start looking for sentences that begin with, I can't do that, or what if I fail, or it's too hard. You know, the negatives, the doubts, the fears. Now we're starting to tie into insecurity's language. So we start to look for that voice of insecurity. And by the way, insecurity is a habit also. You're not born insecure. We don't come into the world insecure. We learn it. And it's not whether you're insecure or not. Because as I see it, we all are insecure to a matter of degree. I mean, let's face it, no one grows up in a perfect world. No one has perfect parents. We have loss in our lives. We have illness. We have trials and tribulations. We develop insecurity. So to some extent, we all know about insecurity. So insecurity generates that fear. The second component is control. Because of our fears, because of insecurity, we try to do what we can to control life. I've heard it said that the driving biological force in nature is the avoidance of pain and the seeking of pleasure. Makes perfect sense to me. But I feel there's another, perhaps even more compelling force, at least from a psychological perspective. And that's the instinctual force to be in control. We humans, we hate being out of control. I don't know about you, but I've been in quicksand and I've been in some tough spots, but we hate being out of control. Everything in us wants to maintain control. Now, although this sounds adaptive, being in control, it's not always a good thing. And the reason it's not always a good thing is because there are two kinds of control: the good kind and the bad kind. It's always good and bad, isn't there? Always this dichotomy in life. The good kind, that's driven by facts. If the roads are icy and you slow down your car, that's good control. If you have diabetes and you watch your sugar intake, that's good control. Nothing wrong with that. It's adaptive, it's constructive, and it's downright smart. You see, this is what we want. We want to be in control of our lives when, in fact, we're dealing with facts. Now, here's the difference. Bad control is driven not by facts, but by fictions. Fictions of insecurity. And this is what depletes us. An insecurity-driven or bad control has different forms. You've heard of perfectionism, or perhaps rumination. How about avoidance? And now we come back to my favorite word, worry. Worry is a very ubiquitous form of control. Now, why is worrying a form of control? Well, think about it for a second. When you worry, typically what you're doing is you're saying, well, what if such and such happens? So what you're doing is you're trying to predict what's going to come around that corner before it reaches you. Because if you could figure it out, then you're telling yourself, then I could be ready, then I could be braced, I'll know what to do. So worry is an attempt to kind of see that future, to protect yourself. So, why is this such a bad thing? I mean, what's the harm in trying to predict what's coming? Well, when we're dealing with the fictions of insecurity, it's not natural. It takes effort to control life. And the bottom line is, controlling life is what depletes us. So, because of insecurity, we started at a young age developing habits, patterns of control. Maybe as a child, maybe you were a worrier as a child. Maybe you were shy. You tended to pull away. Maybe you were negative and pushed people away. Hostility. That's a form of control too. If I push you away, you can't hurt me. So there are many ways that we try to control ourselves in order to avoid the chaos of insecurity. What happens is we start with what I might call a control juggle. So you develop early in life, you develop strategies of control. And think of it as a juggler. We have all these balls in the air. Usually you have a whole array of controlling strategies. Maybe the what-ifs, the worrying, the rumination. Maybe you're a bit of a perfectionist. By the way, a perfectionist isn't trying to be perfect. The perfectionist is just trying to avoid messing up. So you have all these balls going, and you're doing fine. You go through life, you're feeling relatively in control. Life's going wonderful. All of a sudden, one of those balls drops. Oh my gosh. And then another. At that point, when your control strategy begins to fall apart, you see, that's where you begin to get symptoms. Because up until that point, you were gliding along. I mean, you were expending that energy, but you know what? You were feeling in control. You weren't feeling taxed. Once that control juggle falters, that's when things begin to cascade around you. That's when you begin to get symptoms. This is why oftentimes in therapy, when patients come in, and they say, I don't understand it. I'm 40-something years old, 50 years old. I've never had anxiety or panic attacks. Why now? Everything was going well. Well, you see, just like the juggler, you were doing well, but like a juggler, the lactic acid will eventually wear you down and eventually bring you to your knees. Depletion occurs whether it's physical or whether it's psychological. The effort to control life will eventually begin to erode your stamina, leaving you susceptible to dropping one of those balls of control. So now we're in a position to complete the picture. Let me repeat the three-stage process that leads to the habit of anxiety and depression. Insecurity generates fear. We're all born with some insecurity, and that insecurity begins to make us feel a bit out of control. So insecurity generates fear. The fear is countered by an attempt to control life. That's where our juggle begins. We develop strategies. And by the way, these strategies follow us through life. They're kind of like a long tail, and we accumulate them. If you look at some of your controlling strategies now, you'll see they're not so different from when you were a child. Look back and you'll see that there's still very much in you a child reflex. So insecurity generates fear. Fear is countered by an attempt to control, and controlling life wears us down. Once you are depleted, then you are at the mercy of symptoms of anxiety and depression. So your habit of anxiety and depression are the end result of this cycle. As with most habits, over time, we become identified with our own habits. When a patient walks in and they say to me, I'm depressed, I immediately stop them and say, wait a second. You are not depressed. There's a part of you that's depressed, or a part of you that's anxious. See, we tend to say, I am my depression, or I am my anxiety, or I'm a worrier. See, what you're doing is you're handing yourself over. You're joining the enemy. You're becoming part of the problem. I mean, it's obvious that habits cling to us, all habits, Velcro-like. They cling to us. They're hard to shake off. Mark Twain once said that smoking is the easiest habit in the world to break. I've done it thousands of times. So why do we cling to habits that are so destructive? Why do we do it? Well, the reason is without trust, without self-trust, controlling life is the only game in town. If you don't have trust to believe in yourself to handle life, you're going to go to the next order of protection, and that's trying to control life. The biggest problem with control is that the attempt to control life is a myth. We don't control life. My cousin owned a restaurant, and on top of the restaurant was his home. He had his house built above the restaurant. And my cousin is a rather controlling person, would be putting it mildly. Perfectionistic, controlling. And he would tell me quite often how proud he was that every last detail in his life was in its place. Every duck was in a row. If it snowed and the snowplow came at 4 in the morning, he'd be out there telling that snowplow exactly where to put the snow. Nothing went by his vision. Everything was under his scrutiny. If the air conditioner broke, he was there standing over the plumber's shoulder telling him just how tight to tighten the bolts. Everything was under his control, and he felt he had absolute control. We were on vacation a few years ago, and he and I were walking along the beach, and he said to me, I've been able to put together a rather stable life. My future is secure. The future for my children is secure. The restaurant is flourishing. I've got people interested in buying it. He couldn't have been happier. And it was on that very day that we got a phone call saying that his restaurant and his house above it had burned to the ground. The only thing left standing was a rock chimney. Now, if he were here today, I'm sure my cousin would be the very first to tell you that we really don't control life. We think we do. We try to control it. But the quest for control is never the answer. Controlling life is an illusion. So that's not what we want to strive for. So in order to dismantle anxiety and depression, to stop the feeding process, let me give you some specifics now on what we can do. First step, learning to separate facts from fictions. Okay. Insecurity spins fictions, fictions of doubts, fears, negatives. I'm 40 years old. I'll never find a husband. Fact or fiction? Well, no one has a crystal ball. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. You see, once you start acting as if you know what tomorrow will bring, I will never find a husband. That can't be factual. That has to be a fiction. Keep in mind, feelings are not facts. Just because you feel something, don't be convinced that that is a fact. Did you hear how she spoke to me? Obviously, she doesn't like me. Fact or fiction? This is what we call mind reading. It's not factual. See, unless you can verify something, it remains a fiction. Confusing facts with fictions is what insecurity does best. So step one is let's start thinking in terms of what are the facts and what are the fictions. Step two, stop listening to that internal dialogue of what I call reflexive, insecure thinking. Stop listening. We separate facts from fiction, and now we stop listening to that voice of negativity, insecurity. I remember when we were learning meditation in my yoga class, one of the pupils wanted to know, I can't stop these thoughts. They just keep bombarding me, because with meditation you try to separate from these thoughts. And my yoga instructor had a beautiful image. He said, those distracting thoughts, think of them as monkeys, jumping from tree to tree, screeching, howling, trying to disturb you. And if you want to learn to meditate, you need to tame your monkeys. You need to tame your monkeys. We need to stop the thinking of these screeching, chattering monkeys, and we need to bring it down to control. Good control. Remember, there's good control. When I was in graduate school, I remember I was studying hypnosis, and we saw a training film. And in the training film, the subject was under a deep state of hypnosis. And the hypnotist said to the patient, I'm going to take a cigarette and I'm going to burn your forearm. And he took an ice cube and he touched the forearm. Of course, as you would expect, being under hypnosis, the patient winced. But what was incredible was that where he touched him with the ice cube, a welt formed. You see, the power of the mind. What we tell ourselves, what we believe. We're talking an incredible incredible power. We're all hypnotists, self-hypnotists. If you have anxiety and depression, you need to understand how hypnosis works. It's suggestion. If you embrace it, it's as simple as that. You become your suggestion. Words are so important. They can hurt us. They can help us. Remember, just do it. Thoughts like, I'm such a loser. Or how about, nothing ever works out for me. These have a hypnotic effect on you. And you know, what's funny is that it doesn't just have an effect on you. It has an effect on those around you. It has an effect on how people react to you. Now, this may sound a little out there, but it's how I feel and what I've noticed. People come to me with depression and anxiety, and they tell me about terrible things in their lives. Bad luck. This is going wrong, that's going wrong. As they begin to shift their center of gravity and become more positive, more accepting, less controlled by insecurity, their luck seems to change. Now, yes, there's subjective evaluation going on here because, I'm kind of looking for that. But nevertheless, I would have to tell you that I have seen this so many times that I'm not reluctant to talk about it, that sometimes as you change and shift your center of gravity, your actual luck changes. Now, I know we don't have a hand in fate and all of that, but somehow, and maybe it's just all this reverberative effect of your positive energy now coming forward, you change the fate of your life. As my yoga instructor might say, you change your karmic destiny. I kind of believe that. Self-coaching is a way to become an active participant to your own internal dialogue. An active participant. My grandmother used to have an expression. She used to say, you can't stop a bird from flying into your hair, but you don't have to help it build a nest. I love that. Isn't that cute? You can't stop a thought, a negative thought, a fear. You can't stop one of these thoughts from percolating up into your head. But you don't have to add a second thought, and a third, and a fourth. You see, that's where you become part of the problem, not part of the solution. This is what you can stop. Now, like I said, until you start to shift that center of gravity, those thoughts will occur. The negatives, the doubts, the fears. They will occur. What you need to start doing right now is recognize whether you're going to feed it and add that second thought, the third, the fourth, or whether you're going to begin to starve it. No, I'm not going there. That's going to hurt me. That's ridiculous. I'm just not buying into that. You pull yourself off any way you can. Any way you can. Remember the old joke, Doc, my arm hurts when I move it like this, to which the doctor says, well, stop moving it like that. You need to stop the kind of thinking that's generating, that's sustaining, that's feeding your anxiety and depression. You need to stop doing that. Sometimes we say no and mean it, and sometimes we say no and don't mean it. The other night I said no to a cookie and ate it. Guess I didn't mean it. If you think you can't say no and mean it, I'll tell you right now, you're wrong. You can say no to whatever that impulse is, to whatever's driving you. So we have 2 steps so far. We're going to separate facts from fictions just to get a little clarity. Then we're going to stop building nests. We're going to stop feeding needlessly that runaway train of insecurity-driven thinking. Now, the 3rd step is learning to let go. Whereas the first 2 steps, fact from fiction, stopping the thinking, these are more active thinking steps. The 3rd step is the opposite. It's letting go. Kind of a non-cognitive step. Now, we've all had head colds. And with a head cold, you become congested, you wheeze, you whine, you cough, do all these terrible things when you have a head cold. And we all know that if you focus on the symptoms of a head cold, you feel terrible. But you also know that if you get distracted, if you turn away from these symptoms, what happens? you tend to almost forget the discomfort. You see, we can learn to ignore discomfort. Now, when you're uncomfortable with anxiety, when you're uncomfortable with depression, there's no doubt this is painful. It's uncomfortable. It causes a kind of mental congestion. But you know what? You don't have to focus on it. Because you know with a head cold, if you start thinking about, oh, my throat feels so bad, it feels 10 times worse. Letting go. Letting go. You can begin to realize that you're tethered to these thoughts out of reflex, habit. So we're talking about breaking habits. Now, if anyone has ever tried to stop smoking or nail biting, you know that habits are resistant to change. You know it's not easy, but you need to stay with it. You need to have this firm will. So in order to let go, you need to be convinced, you need to be patient, and you need to take every opportunity to walk away from these deleterious symptoms. If you've ever studied meditation, meditation is perhaps the best metaphor for letting go. In meditation, there's one instruction. You watch your breath. That's it. You follow your breath as it goes in, and you follow your breath as it comes out. In, out. How simple. Yet it could take a lifetime to master. Why is that? Well, because the chatter, remember the monkeys? That chatter of our thoughts, distracting thoughts. Now, what you learn in meditation is that you don't fight off these thoughts. You more or less just come back to your breath. Your breath in and your breath out. And you let go of those thoughts. You pull yourself away and you just let them be. And you stand apart from them. Visuals can help to let go. Let's imagine you have a bunch of balloons in your hand. And each one of those balloons are one of your worldly concerns, one of your worries, one of your fears, your doubts. So let's say we begin by letting go of one of those balloons. And you can do this in your mind because the visualization will connect you in different ways to the process. And you watch that balloon as it drifts slowly into the sky. And you see it getting smaller and smaller. Force the vision. See, this is a distraction for you. See, rather than focusing on the discomfort, now you're imagining this balloon and you're watching it grow smaller and smaller until it vanishes. Now, for those of you that may be a bit more aggressive, how about a soccer field? You're on a soccer field, and soccer balls are being thrown out onto your field, and you become very territorial about this. So what you do is you decide that you're going to get rid of these soccer balls. Each soccer ball represents a worry, a doubt, or a fear. And you go up to the first soccer ball, which is a worry thought, and you go whack, and you kick that ball off the field. And you go up to a second ball, whack, and you kick it off the field. Again, the visual, it's helping you let go, turn away from, ignore. So we separate facts from fiction. Then we stop the thinking, and then we let it go. So rather than anticipatory, worrisome living, let me suggest that we think instead, when we leave here today, about a new concept of living your life. Let's call it reactive living. When you're driving your car, you typically aren't thinking about, what if a squirrel runs in front of me? What will I do? No, you're driving your car, the windows down, you're enjoying the nice spring weather, you've got the radio going, and if a squirrel happens to run in front of you, what do? You hit the brake, you veer to the left or right. Instinctually, you react. You react. You see, this is the key. You don't need to anticipate the squirrel. What you need to do is trust your ability to react instinctually, in the moment. This is a hard concept to truly grasp at first, but the more you are with it. We have 6 million plus years of evolutionary instinct encapsulated in us. If you think of the ego, that part of you which does all this cognitive thinking, the worrying, the fearing, that's this little island in this vast ocean of potential. You see, that vast ocean, that's where the instincts lie, the intuitions, the capacity to protect you, to survive. That's what made you hit the brake when that squirrel ran in front of you and veered to the left. You didn't have to think about that or process it. You see, that was automatic. That was reactive living. Now, what happens with anxiety and depression? You probably already know this. You're living anywhere but right here. You're living in the past, you're living in the future, and your present is somewhere here, but your life is here, spinning. I call that time traveling. You're nowhere, but you're not in the present. Trust is a big word. It's a very important word. In order to embrace reactive living, you need to become more connected with a willingness to trust. It takes a courageous attitude to go ahead and put those 6 million years of instinct into play. Granted, start off small. Find some easy challenges. I mean, I'm talking really small. I mean, it could be as simple as vanilla, chocolate. Go with your gut. Just see if it's the end of the world. Don't sit there and debate. Don't deliberate. Take the shot. Take the shot. Start to learn that even if you make the wrong choice, and I'm loath to use the word mistake, but even if you make the wrong choice, it's okay. The world doesn't end. You see, what happens with anxiety and depression is you're so mired in trying to make sure that nothing goes wrong because you're anticipating that chaos. You're trying so hard to protect yourself. There was a Zen monk. He's walking along a mountain path. A tiger comes bounding down the path after him. The monk decides that he doesn't particularly want to die in this moment, so he leaps off the cliff and grabs onto a vine. Now, this is a substantial cliff. There's a 300-foot precipice below. So he's got the tiger above, and the tiger is trying to reach him, trying to swoop down, trying to hurt him. Now, the vine begins to break. It's starting to come out from the cliff wall. At that moment, just before dying, the monk notices a strawberry growing out of the side of the cliff. And he looks at the strawberry. And he says, "It's a magnificent red strawberry. I think I'll eat it." And then, poof, he dies. Terrific story, huh? What that tells us is that for that monk, in that moment, in that reactive moment, there was absolute bliss. Because there was no past, there was no future, there was no tiger, there was no imminent death. There was only the strawberry. That precision to be in that moment, right here, without an anticipation of what's coming, that's where your life needs to be. That's where you need to look for the strawberry moments, the reactive moments. And you know, it's very, very important for you to realize that in order to appreciate those strawberries, you are going to have to take a few steps. And you have to realize that, as I said earlier, anxiety and depression are habits. And once you get used to differentiating this concept from mental illness, you realize that you're no longer in the back seat with what ails you. Now you're right up there behind the steering wheel. It's truly up to you. I know it's an unconventional concept, but you know what? By calling it a habit, you know, we do understand habits. You know, this is not a mystery to us. We know about habits. We know habits are learned, habits can be broken. By calling it a habit, you know what to do. And you don't have to rely on outside sources. You start to look inside and ask yourself, what am I doing? See, that's where you need to be. You need to be behind that wheel. And that's exactly where you will begin to dismantle, where you will begin to starve the anxiety and depression. Thank you very much. We have two questions. Let's see. Can't depression be cured? can depression be caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain that needs to be corrected? Wouldn't that be mental illness as opposed to emotional illness? It's a very important question because in order to embrace a self-coaching philosophy, we need to realize that when we start to engage in a process of depletion, when we start to feed insecurity, we begin to deplete ourselves. We don't just deplete ourselves emotionally. Stress doesn't just wear us out in terms of our feelings. It changes your chemistry. Now, what's different about my approach is that it's the chicken-egg thing. See, I see it as that the ultimate imbalances that are created in depression and anxiety, these imbalances are created by the habits of insecurity. So over time, think of it as a bucket with a hole in the bottom of the bucket. Over time, drip, 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 we begin to deplete ourselves. So yes, anxiety and depression are whole body problems. I mentioned that in the beginning. They are chemical and psychological problems. That's why medication works. I'm not opposed to medication. Sometimes we have to stop the river that flows against us and slow it down in order to get a level playing field to progress with a program like self-coaching. Medication has its place, but an illness is something you catch. And again, I prefer something you generate. How helpful are meditation, diet, and exercise in fighting and overcoming anxiety and depression? Just as depression and anxiety are whole body problems, the solution is a whole body problem. Your diet, your exercise, your well-being, these are all adjuncts to feeling better, putting a more positive thrust to your life, taking the initiative to overcome the hurdles of stagnation. So all that you do that contributes to the attitude of just do it, everything contributes to your ultimate conviction. Remember hypnosis, what you believe and what you embrace. Believe it, you'll do it. I have if anyone would like to reach me or contact me personally, my website is selfcoaching.net. And I'd be glad to have you come by, see a little bit more about self-coaching. And I answer posts every day, so feel free if you have any personal questions to come by. After this talk, I'm going to be at the Barnes & Noble table. I'll be signing some books. I thank you so much. I enjoyed being here today and enjoy this terrific day. Thank you.